For 4 seasons, one small-town towing company turned a patch of rural North Carolina into must-see television. Then, without so much as a farewell special, the cameras simply stopped rolling. No cast reunion, no series finale hyped for weeks in advance, just silence. And in the years since, the family behind Lizard Lick Towing has lived through something no reality show could ever have scripted. Real tragedy, real courtrooms, and a real fight to rebuild a life once the spotlight moved on. This is the story of how a single truck repo outfit became a national phenomenon, why the show actually came to an end, and what happened to Ron, Amy, and Bobby once the world stopped watching. Long before reality TV found them, Ron and Amy Shirley were just two people trying to build something out of almost nothing. In 1998, the couple opened Lizard Lick Towing and Recovery with a single truck and whatever savings they could scrape together. Lizard Lick itself isn't even a formally incorporated town. It's a small unincorporated community near Wendell, Wake County, North Carolina, the kind of place most Americans would never have reason to know existed. For over a decade, the Shirleys built their business the hard way, chasing down unpaid vehicles, dealing with furious debtors, and slowly expanding their operation. By the time a television crew ever set foot in their office, Lizard Lick Towing had already grown into a serious operation with a full fleet of trucks and a team of employees. They weren't looking to become famous. They were just trying to keep the lights on. That changed when a true TV crew came through the area scouting families for an entirely different project. As the story goes, producers were hunting for participants for a segment tied to a family swap format, and someone pointed them toward the Shirleys almost as an afterthought. What the crew found instead was something far more compelling: a husband and wife with an unmistakable on-camera chemistry, a business built on genuine tension and drama, and a colorful cast of characters who didn't need a script to be entertaining. Ron had a way with words that would later be nicknamed Ronisms by fans. Half sermon, half stand-up routine, all Southern charm. Amy was blunt, tough, and impossible to ignore. And working alongside them was Bobby Brantley, a man with maybe the most unlikely origin story in reality TV history. He became part of the crew only after his own truck got repossessed by the company and he worked off the debt. Before the Shirleys got their own series, True TV tested the waters by folding them into an earlier show called All Worked Up, essentially using it as a proving ground to see if audiences would respond to the repo lifestyle. They did, enthusiastically. That reaction was enough to convince the network to build a standalone series around the family, and Lizard Lick Towing officially premiered in February 2011. The show's success was almost immediate. Within its first couple of seasons, Lizard Lick Towing was consistently pulling in millions of viewers per episode and became one of True TV's flagship programs, regularly topping the ratings among younger male viewers during its time slot. For a cable network built on a modest budget and a niche audience, that kind of performance was enormous. Advertisers took notice. Merchandise followed: branded apparel, hats, even a barbecue sauce with Ron's name attached to it. The show was eventually picked up for broadcast overseas as well, introducing Ron, Amy, and Bobby to audiences well beyond the United States. The town of Lizard Lick itself became an unlikely tourist stop. Fans drove from other states just to see the actual shop, take a photo next to the sign, and maybe catch a glimpse of the cast going about their day. A quiet gravel lot that had spent years processing paperwork and impounded vehicles was now fielding visitors who treated it like a roadside attraction. The show's popularity also helped kick off a broader trend in reality programming, inspiring other blue-collar, high-stakes workplace shows that tried to capture a similar formula in different industries and cities. What made the show resonate wasn't just the chases or the confrontations, it was the family dynamic underneath all of it. Ron represented the moral compass of the operation, a man who preached forgiveness on Sundays and chased down delinquent borrowers during the week. Amy broke the mold of what audiences expected from women on reality television. She wasn't there as an accessory to the drama, she was a competitive powerlifter and a licensed funeral director who ran significant parts of the business and never hesitated to get physically involved when things got heated. Bobby provided the comic relief and the muscle an everyman figure fans could relate to. Together, the trio offered something that felt authentic in an era when a lot of reality programming felt calculated and hollow. As the show's profile grew, so did scrutiny of how real it actually was. Like many shows in the reality genre, Lizard Lick Towing operated as what's often called a docudrama, a program built around real people and real underlying events, but with certain scenes recreated or staged for the cameras to heighten the drama. This wasn't unique to the Shirley's show. It was, and still is, an industry-standard practice across much of unscripted television, disclosed through the small print legal disclaimers that scroll by at the end of nearly every episode of shows in this genre. Viewers eventually picked up on inconsistencies, camera angles that seemed impossibly well-positioned for supposedly spontaneous confrontations, physical altercations that looked more choreographed than chaotic. Ron would later be candid about the fact that while the underlying repossessions were genuine, the surrounding drama was often amplified for entertainment value. From a production standpoint, this made sense. Filming a completely unscripted repossession carries real legal and safety risks, and staging certain elements gave the crew a way to deliver dramatic television without putting people in unnecessary danger every single week. Still, for longtime fans who had assumed they were watching pure, unfiltered reality, the acknowledgement was a bit of a letdown. It's a familiar trade-off across the genre. Audiences want authenticity, but authenticity without any structure is hard to turn into a watchable weekly episode. By 2014, Lizard Lick Towing had run for 4 seasons and 91 episodes, and the series came to a close that August. Unlike some shows that fade out due to declining viewership, the ending wasn't really about a lack of audience interest. The show had remained one of True TV's stronger performers. Instead, the cancellation reflected a broader shift happening at the network level. Around this period, True TV was in the process of repositioning its entire brand identity, moving away from the gritty blue-collar actuality programming that had defined its earlier years and leaning much more heavily into comedy-driven content. Shows built around pranks and scripted comedy formats were becoming the network's new priority, and the kind of high-intensity, docudrama-style programming that had made Lizard Lick Towing a hit increasingly felt out of step with where the network wanted to go. There were other pressures at play behind the scenes as well. Filming a show centered on real repossessions came with genuine legal exposure. Debtors who felt they'd been portrayed unfairly, concerns about consent and privacy, and the ordinary friction that comes from putting people's worst financial moments on national television. Managing that kind of risk over multiple seasons requires resources, and as the show's fame grew, so did the practical costs of production, security, and insurance. On a personal level, Ron has also spoken about how difficult it became to balance the demands of a television production schedule with actually running a functioning towing company and serving as a pastor in his community. When it came time to negotiate another season, both sides ultimately concluded that it made more sense to part ways than to continue. There was also visible strain within the cast in the show's later stretch. Bobby Brantley, who had become one of the most beloved figures on the series, reportedly felt increasingly overshadowed as the show's branding centered more and more on the Shirley name. He stepped away for a period, even exploring the idea of a solo project, before eventually returning to the show. But by most accounts, the easy chemistry that had defined the early seasons had shifted by the time the series wrapped. None of this played out as a dramatic, publicized falling out. It was simply the quieter kind of wear that comes from years of high-pressure production work between people who started out as friends and co-workers. Ron made an attempt to keep some version of the brand alive after the cancellation, floating the idea of a spin-off and later exploring independent streaming options to bypass the traditional network model. Neither effort managed to replicate the reach the original series had enjoyed on cable. Slowly, the crowds of tourists thinned out, the merchandise sales cooled, and the family shifted their focus back towards simply running their business day to day. 4 years after the show ended, life in Wendell returned to something resembling normal, until February 2022, when the family was hit with a tragedy no amount of television fame could have prepared them for. Ron's son, 21-year-old Harley Alexander Shirley, known to friends and family as Alex, had appeared on the show as a child during its original run. On the night of February 17, 2022, Alex was in Garner, North Carolina, attending a memorial gathering for a friend who had recently died in a car accident. Afterward, while sitting in a parked vehicle at a nearby gas station, the car was sprayed with gunfire, reportedly around 20 rounds fired into the back of the vehicle. Alex was killed at the scene. A young woman named Sophie Haggie, who was seated beside him, was also struck and left permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Investigators later indicated that Alex had been the intended target of the shooting, while Hagee had not. Ron confirmed his son's death publicly on social media, writing an emotional tribute to Alex and asking for prayers for his family. In the weeks and months that followed, he spoke openly with local news outlets about grief, faith, and his effort to find a path toward forgiveness for the people responsible, even while continuing to push for accountability through the courts. It was a return to the public eye that no one in the family would have wished for, worlds away from the staged drama of a repo show. The case against those responsible for Alex's death took years to work through the legal system. Multiple people were eventually charged in connection with the shooting. In late 2024, the first shooter to stand trial, Nathan Jackson, was convicted on charges including first-degree murder, attempted murder, and discharging a firearm into a vehicle causing serious injury. Because he was 16 years old at the time of the crime, his sentence carries the possibility of parole after 40 years rather than an outright life sentence without parole. Ron was present in the courtroom for the verdict and, rather than expressing anger, chose to speak publicly about forgiveness, while still emphasizing that accountability mattered. The following year, a second person involved in the shooting, Joshua Stewart, was also sentenced, receiving consecutive prison terms. Investigators continued working the case even after those convictions, eventually tracking down and arresting a fifth suspect, Kevin Nicholson, in Philadelphia in mid-2025. For a family that had waited years for any sense of resolution, each arrest and conviction offered a small measure of closure, even as nothing could undo what had happened. Throughout the process, the Shirleys also stayed connected to Sophie Hagee and her recovery, supporting her as she adjusted to life after being paralyzed in the same attack that took Alex's life. More than a decade after the show went off the air, Ron Shirley is still deeply involved in the business that started it all. He remains at the helm of Lizard Lick Towing and Recovery, overseeing daily operations much as he did before the cameras ever arrived. Alongside his work in the towing industry, Ron has leaned further into his role as a pastor, serving with the Eastern chapter of what he calls Dirt Church, an unconventional, community-based ministry that meets people where they are rather than inside a traditional church building. He's also become a published author and remains active on social media, where longtime fans still find pieces of the Ronisms that made him a fan favorite in the first place. Rather than chasing another shot at national television, Ron appears to have settled into a life that blends running the family business with his ministry work, staying rooted in the same community where the whole story began. Amy Shirley has remained just as central to the operation, continuing to help run the business side of Lizard Lick Towing and Recovery. Away from the office, she's carried her competitive spirit into powerlifting at the master's level and has built a following centered on fitness and strength training, particularly for women navigating midlife. She has also stayed close to her role as a mother, and in the years since Alex's death, she and Ron have worked to keep his memory alive through community support efforts connected to his name. For a woman who once stood out simply for defying expectations of what a female cast member on a repo show should look like, Amy's post-show life reflects the same independence and resilience that made her a standout in the first place. Bobby Brantley's path after the show took a notably different turn. In 2019, Bobby underwent surgery to remove a brain tumor, a serious health scare that pulled him out of the public eye for a period of recovery. He has since settled into a quieter life in Pilot, North Carolina, alongside his wife, Melanie, with whom he shares a large blended family. Bobby has largely stepped back from the entertainment industry altogether, choosing privacy and family life over chasing further television opportunities. His journey, from an accidental cast member who started out as an angry customer, to a fan favorite, to a man focused on health and family well outside the spotlight, stands as one of the more understated, where are they now stories to come out of the Lizard Lick Towing era. Even though Lizard Lick Towing hasn't aired a new episode since 2014, the show has never really disappeared. Older episodes continue to circulate on streaming platforms, introducing the Shirleys and Bobby to viewers who weren't even old enough to watch the original run. The series is often remembered as part of a wave of blue-collar reality programming that reshaped what basic cable networks thought audiences wanted to watch. Ordinary people doing high-stakes, physically demanding jobs, filmed with just enough dramatization to keep things exciting without losing the human element underneath. Talk of a reunion or an anniversary special has occasionally surfaced online, fueled by nostalgic fans who never quite let go of the show. Nothing has been confirmed, and given everything the family has been through since the cameras stopped rolling, it's easy to understand why they might approach any potential comeback with far more caution than they once had. Fame came quickly to a small towing company in rural North Carolina, and it left just as quickly, without much fanfare. What's remained in its place is a family that weathered real hardship long after the television lights went dark, and that, more than any staged confrontation or dramatic repo chase, might be the most authentic story Lizard Lick Towing ever told.